Hey everyone, if you're new here, I'm Jake, and today we're taking a look at the Flatiron School. They offer a couple different coding boot camps. I'm going to be taking a look at the curriculum and reviewing it as someone who went through a boot camp and ended up becoming a software engineer. I think it's interesting to take a look at these and kind of talk about my criticisms of the curriculum and things I like, things I don't like about them, so that people that are maybe interested in attending one of these have another perspective to go off. Please take what I have to say with a grain of salt. I've never met the people at Flatiron. I've never spoken to any of their students, so I'm simply reacting to the marketing material that I have access to. Don't want to go in too deep into this since I've spoke about it in other videos, so let's jump in. Flatironschool.com is where you can find all of the information on their programs. There's a software engineering course, which I've chosen. They have a marketing page here you can click to learn more. I've already gone ahead and downloaded the syllabus, so let's get into that. So they have a 15-week program. It's broken down into 5 different phases. They also have a prep, which is something you complete before you get there. A lot of programs do this, and this is really fantastic. Get you started on some studying before you arrive. So on the program and pace and schedule section towards the bottom, we see that it's 15 weeks and 60 hours a week. They don't really have designations of how long each section is going to take week-wise. I guess that's just subject to change. But we can just assume that if there's 5 sections in 15 weeks, maybe 3 weeks per section. I know that that's not exact, but that's the information that we have to go on. Okay, so here we have the overview page. This is just going to give a short understanding of the different phases. Okay, so it looks like phase 1 is front-end development basics, and then we get into phase 2, which is more focused on the React framework. Then we get into phase 3, which is probably a basic understanding of Python, okay, and then SQL and object relational mapping. Interesting, great. And then we get into backend web APIs. So this is Flask, which is the backend web framework for Python. Okay, interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. And then we end it with a cumulative project. Okay, at first glance, this seems like a pretty standard progression. We learn the basics of the front end. We learned a front end framework. We learn the basics of the back end, then we learn a back end framework, and then there's a project at the end. This seems like a very understandable, natural flow of learning. Although I will say I didn't see a mention of data structures or algorithms or maybe basic computer science concepts. That would have been nice. Okay, as I mentioned maybe before, there is a little prep section. They have you work on environment setup, command line stuff, HTML and CSS, and Git. I would say some of these are kind of complex things to learn on your own, but certainly HTML and CSS, there's tons of things like Code Academy and other things online that will teach you how to do this by yourself. Really well put together. You shouldn't really need help, but some of the command line stuff in Git is a little daunting for a first timer. So anyways, still nice to see that some of this stuff is done before you even start. Okay. Phase 1, so this is kind of the basics of front-end JavaScript stuff. We learn about functions, that's great. Variable scope, okay. Working with data structures in JavaScript. Okay, so here's where we get into data structures. Arrays and objects. Okay, this is a little disappointing. I was hoping that maybe we would get in a little bit more into depth other than just arrays and objects, especially because the way that arrays and objects are used in JavaScript is very specific to JavaScript. And it would really benefit to learn from a more like academic sense how arrays work and, what objects really are, talk about maps and, hash maps and things like that. But I have a feeling that's not what they're talking about here. So, but still good to know. And then we learned about the DOM and how to query methods to select and modify DOM nodes. This is something I've spoken about before. I think this is kind of overkill. This is not something you will most likely see nowadays because, as you will see later, we're going to be using React or a different front-end framework at your first job that probably won't directly interact with the DOM API. Maybe a cursory understanding of what that is, how it works is fine, but to be practicing, querying the DOM nodes, maybe not necessary. JavaScript events. Okay, learning different types of JavaScript events. Yeah, that's helpful. You do need to know what events are and you need to understand what the events are, how they're triggered. That makes sense. Communicating with the server, the request response cycle. Okay, so is this like Ajax So probably how to use the fetch API is what I'm assuming. Asynchronous code. Okay, that's fine, I guess. Again, you probably won't really see fetch a lot if you're using, so yeah, I don't know. I'm not gonna beat a dead horse. This is fine. Okay, execution context in JavaScript. Students learn about execution context, the difference between global and function execution contexts, and how to leverage that knowledge to ensure their code has access to the variable. Is this just scope? Did we not talk about scope? We talked about variable scope. Okay, maybe I'm overlooking something, but I think that this would have been already kind of covered. Okay, in general, the first phase is mostly good stuff. And if you have 3 weeks to cover this, I assume that you're getting pretty good in-depth knowledge. Okay, phase 2, front-end web apps. In this module, students learn the benefits of leveraging the React.js framework to build apps. They will also learn how to set up and use Node Package Manager to add functionality to a JavaScript project and continue to develop their skills. Okay, that's fine. Yep, setting up React and using NPM. Components and props. Okay, I should preface this by saying I'm not a React person, so this is kind of confusing to me. So it's difficult for me to give a proper response here, but if you're wanting to use React in a professional sense, it's pretty much a good idea to spend time on it. I'm not going to be able to comment on the particulars of everything they have lined out here, unfortunately. Like state and events and stuff. Like I know that props is a React specific thing. State and events, side effects and data fetching, client-side routing. All of this looks pretty relevant. Unfortunately, I can't comment on a more experienced level, but okay. Phase 2, for the most part, to me, looks good. Okay, back-end development. Phase 3. Students begin learning the back-end programming language Python, building on the programming concepts they've learned from JavaScript. Students will learn how Python syntax differs from JavaScript and how to construct conditional statements and loops in Python. Okay, so this is another thing I've seen in other programs. A lot of programs try to just do JavaScript, but this one has used a different language for the backend. I would have liked to see them use a static language because a lot of apps have static backends or use backends that are written with static languages. I don't see a lot of apps that have backends written in Python. I'm not saying they don't exist. It completely depends on the company you work at and what area you're in. In my experience, I don't see it incredibly often. I think a more standard choice would be something like Java or C# or Go. So I think it would be helpful to expose people to static languages. And here we're just teaching another dynamic language. I don't even understand why you wouldn't just continue teaching JavaScript if you're going to teach another dynamic language. Okay, so Python fundamentals, data structures. Okay, we talked about arrays and objects. Now we're going to talk about lists and dictionaries. Okay, great. Again, I would prefer maybe a more in-depth understanding of data structures. Introduction to object orientation in Python. Students learn the basics of object-oriented Python, including classes and instances. Okay, yeah, understanding object-oriented programming is going to be incredibly important. It's going to be used in most of your apps, really. So that's good. This is all good. Okay, more stuff about object-oriented programming. Class variables and methods. This feels like this could have just been bubbled into... Okay, so they've just broken this into 3 different pieces. I guess object-oriented programming is like a kind of a large subject, but interesting. Okay, getting started with SQL. So now we set up the SQLite database. This is something I like about this program, that it's been till the third phase that we're now getting into database stuff. So this isn't just jammed down your throat from the beginning, is that you have to have a database to have an app. We've worked through the front end, we've worked through React, you've learned some back end stuff, now we're getting to the database. This is a linear progression. So I do like that. Okay, we talk about table relations. That's good. It's a relational database. And then we talk about object relational mapping. I like that they have this as its own section. Using a type mapper or an object relational mapper is something that's really common and something you will probably run into. So it's good to spend some time learning one, if not just understanding the concept. Okay, overall, I think phase 3 is pretty good. It feels a little bloated. You're learning a new language. We spent two phases learning JavaScript, but now we're learning a new language. We're learning object-oriented programming, and we're learning about the database. It's a little bloated. This is a lot of information, I think, in this phase. So that's a little tricky. Oh, and there's more. Okay. Using SQL alchemy. Students learn everything they need to use one of the most popular. Okay, this is the object relational mapper. Okay, I see. All right, that makes sense. And then in the final module of phase 3, they learn how they can use SQL alchemy methods to create relationships between the models in their app. Okay, yeah, I mean, that seems fine. Again, this seems like a lot of content. Phase 4, Python Flask fundamentals. Students learn the fundamentals of Flask from building single-file applications to understand the flow of data. Additionally, they begin to implement data processing into their Flask applications with Flask SQL Alchemy and Flask Migrate. Okay, CRUD with Flask. In the CRUD with Flask module, students learn to build out CRUD actions in the back end. Okay, so here's where we start talking about RESTful routes. This is great. Yeah, this is a nice progression. We talked about setting up the back end, object-oriented stuff, setting up the database, and now we're talking about routing and RESTful routes and stuff like that. This makes sense. HTTP status codes. Validations. Students learn the common methods for implementing validations on models. Okay, so model validation. Okay. That makes sense. Full stack development. Students build a new Flask API backend for their first full stack application. They get a hands-on experience adding a React front end to their Flask API and setting it up to make fetch requests to the Flask server in response to user actions. Okay. Students will also learn about WebSocket, a protocol for maintaining. Okay. Yeah, again, I would skip this is something I've talked about before. I would skip WebSockets. It's not, I wouldn't call it complicated. I would call it unnecessary, especially when there's so many other things to focus on. I've never done WebSockets in Flask. Maybe it's super easy. But it's not about how easy it is to add. It's about the conceptual understanding of what you're doing and what WebSockets are and why we would use them and what's happening under the hood, which gets into networking stuff, which we haven't really discussed very much here. So that's my only worry about that. Maybe it's just a really simple 2-minute, here's what WebSockets are, let's throw it up on the screen, and anyway, let's talk about something else now. Who knows? Serialization, learning about active model serializer to customize the JSON that's returned from the backend. By using SQL Alchemy association macros, okay, I don't know, I could take it or leave it. I mean, some serialization is fine. Is that its own module? Authentication, learn the fundamentals of cookies, how to configure it for Flask, and how to leverage cookies in sessions. Okay, again, another thing I've talked about before, if this is just something really quick and simple, like, hey, we're gonna add auth, we add this library and do these 5 different things and now it's done, that's fine. Spending a lot of time on this, maybe just not worth it. And then deploying, students learn the fundamentals of packaging and deploying apps using WSGIs and online deployment platforms to deploy a full stack Flask React application. I don't really think it's worth it to talk about this. This is like a can of worms. You have to basically get into what hosting is and all the different ways that you can host, all the different providers, the ups and downs, configuring hosting options, and like this could easily be a black hole. So this kind of worries me. Maybe if you just pick one cloud provider, have some basic instructions on how to deploy up some code, and then just say, you can research more on your own time, that's fine. But to spend resources on this doesn't seem like a good use of time. Okay, and then they have a cumulative project. The final phase, students begin working on their capstone project. This is a solo project. That's kind of a bummer. It'd be nice to see it be a group project. They make an app of their choice. They work with instructors. They receive instructor feedback. Once it's completed, they make a presentation. And then students have access to bonus materials to work on their own for algorithm practice challenges. Great. I would have liked to see some more emphasis on like resume building and applying. And they say here there's live coding assessments and stuff. So maybe they have people buddy up to do practice interviews, which is really helpful. I would like to see that. So maybe that's going on here and they just left that out. So then we have the program pace and schedule. I think I went over it before. And then a little bit more marketing material. I think if I was to sum up my thoughts, I do like that this feels like a natural progression of learning. I will say, as a common critique that I have for these kind of things, It seems weird to use Python as the back end. If you're just going to continue to teach dynamic languages, just use Node and Express or another JavaScript framework in the back end. If you want to teach a second language, pick a static one. Teach Java, teach C#, teach Go. Okay, phase one, I think that this is really good. This is pretty much all solid stuff. Maybe some of this stuff is, I don't know how much time they're going to spend on it, but phase two, can't really comment too much on it. It seems solid. Phase three looks good. It just seems really packed. So maybe some things like learning about the SQL could have a little bit more focus on them. It feels like we blow right over them and we spend a ton of time on the object relational stuff. All of the mapping and all the mapping libraries kind of blows over the base understanding of SQL. And your base understanding of SQL will serve you much better than being super adept with a type mapper of Python, which may not transfer to your first job. So understanding SQL conceptually would be better. And then finally, the backend web APIs look pretty good to me. I would be curious to see if Django is more popular than Flask or the other way around. Who knows? I don't know. And then, maybe less time on authentication and deployment is what I would say. But overall, this is a pretty strong curriculum. I would obviously make a couple changes to it, but it seems like I really do approve of the way it's structured sequentially in a way that makes sense to me. Hey guys, Jake from the future here, just jumping in. I forgot to mention in my outro and summation that there was not a proper data structures and algorithms section in this curriculum. We touched on it once or twice in the front end and in the back end, but there was not a dedicated section that mentioned the fundamentals of data structures and algorithms. While I may have my personal opinions on the importance of algorithms, it is very obvious that you need this knowledge in your hireability skills, and it will be incredibly important during your interviews. They mentioned that there's interview practice at the end, but it cannot be overstated that basic conceptual knowledge of data structures and algorithms is essential. So I think that's one major criticism that I have of this that I didn't vocalize quite correctly when I was filming this. There in a 15-week program, there needs to be at least one full week and ideally 2 to 3 full weeks talking about data structures and algorithms. And I feel in this, we kind of just scratched the surface of it for 1 or 2 weeks. Anyway, that's it for this one, guys. Appreciate you checking it out. Let me know if there's any other curriculums you would like me to review, and definitely subscribe if you want to see more. So thanks again. See ya.